Hello and welcome to Generation 16, the series that showcases the games of Sega's Mega Drive. I'm your host, Greg Stewart. In this episode, we continue to look at the games of December 1990, including the beginning of what will be a ton of shooters released this month. Let's get started. The first of three games released on December 14th is yet another coin-op shooter. Atomic Robo-Kid was originally released to arcades in 1988, and found its way to a half dozen consoles and computers in the subsequent years. Robo-Kid is unlike any shooter thus far on the Mega Drive. It doesn't feature forced scrolling. The Kid has full 360-degree movement and can scroll the levels in all four directions, assuming the current level allows it. Another twist on the formula is the branching paths. Each level in the game is relatively short and always ends with a doorway or two to enter. This setup keeps the game from getting boring at first, but there really isn't enough variety here to make good use of the feature in the long run. Atomic Robo-Kid is the first appearance on the Genesis by the infamous Micronix development studio. None of us even knew of its existence back in the day, though nowadays anyone interested in video game history has probably at least heard the name. This contract studio is responsible for dozens of NES games, mostly ports of other studios' arcade games like Capcom's 1942, Taito's Elevator Action, and SNK's Ikari Warriors. Micronix was notorious for terrible games filled with graphic glitches, awful slowdown, and just all-around shoddy workmanship. It's weird then that its first crack at the Mega Drive actually turned out pretty okay. I mean, at least relative to Micronix's normal standards. In fact, the game looks and plays very similarly to the arcade original. And in Micronix's defense, most of the rough bits in Atomic Robo-Kid were present in the arcade version as well. Atomic Robo-Kid was a product of UPL Corporation, which was a subsidiary of Universal Games, also known as Aruze Corporation. Universal's main claim to fame was the Mr. Do series, a Dig Dug-style chase game that spawned multiple sequels. UPL is credited with the fourth game in the series, Do Run Run. Universal Games' other big title was Space Panic, considered by some the grandfather of the platforming genre, having predated Nintendo's Donkey Kong by about a year. Atomic Robo-Kid is a neat idea, and does a lot of things right. Even the bosses are pretty impressive, filling large areas of the screen, each one being followed by a unique one-on-one duel with another Robo-Kid-sized robot. but the free scrolling tends to cause more problems than it's worth. As this is an older game, enemies reappear almost every time their spawn points come back on screen, meaning having to backtrack a bit will usually end in the kid surrounded by enemies on all sides. What really puts a damper on the whole thing, though, is the absolutely infuriating power-up system. Every now and then a gem will be dropped, which can be shot so that it cycles from one weapon or upgrade to the next. The problem is that the power-up which will appear is completely random, and if you happen to need a particular weapon, it's not unheard of to sit in one spot juggling a power-up gem for what feels like an eternity, praying to land on the proper icon. Having said that, amassing a full arsenal of weapons in Robo-Kid can feel pretty great. In later levels, there are loads of sections that obviously call for very specific guns, and figuring out which one to use where is a lot of fun. In late 1990, Nintendo still had a stranglehold on third-party licensees, and Atomic Robo-Kid appears to be an early example of a publisher sidestepping Nintendo's wrath by releasing games under a different name. This is the first game released by Treco, which was a subsidiary of Sammy Corporation, which had been releasing NES games for a few years by this point. This is also significant because 14 years later, Sega and Sammy would merge to form Sega Sammy Holdings. On Generation 16, we've taken a look at the launch of the Mega Drive in 3 major world markets: Japan, North America, and the United Kingdom. But Sega's 16-bit powerhouse made its way to a few other countries in 1990. South Korea was a challenging market for Japanese electronics manufacturers. After regaining its independence from Japan following World War II, South Korea imposed a ban on Japanese cultural imports. As such, Nintendo and Sega could not enter the market themselves, and so struck deals with Korean companies to release their games and hardware into the region. Hyundai handled the distribution of the Famicom under the name Comboy, while Samsung distributed the Master System as the Game Boy. In May 1990, the Mega Drive was released as the Samsung Super Game Boy.
16-bit 게임, 삼성 슈퍼 게임보이.
It was basically a Japanese NTSC system, capable of playing Japanese cartridges. However, Samsung handled the distribution and localization of Super Game Boy games in the region as well.
안녕합니다. 꿈일까, 생실까. 16-bit 삼성 슈퍼 게임보이.
It even released a few Master System games for play on the 16-bit system, and at least one South Korea exclusive title, Space Turtle Ship. The system was eventually rebranded the Super Aladdin Boy. Samsung was pushing a line of computers called the Aladdin in the early 90s, and the thinking is that the Mega Drive and the Master System, which was still in the market, were renamed in order to use similar branding across the entire line of Samsung electronics. According to numbers published in a 1994 issue of Game World magazine, the Game Boy was by far the best seller in the region during the early 90s.
Aladdin Boy!
Outselling the Comboy, Super Comboy, and Super Game Boy combined. It also appears that, eventually, the Super Comboy became the more popular system in the region. It has to be assumed that the Comboy in particular lost a lot of legitimate sales due to the ridiculous number of Famicom clones available in South Korea. The second shooter, released in December of 1990, comes courtesy of the Mega Drive's original third-party publisher, Technosoft. The intro cinema to Elemental Master is a nice touch, though it's a bit jarring as we're clearly joining the story after some very important developments. Basically, what you need to know is King Lorelei has been tricked and imprisoned. Jira here is the one who did it. And he's overthrown the city of Lorelei by freeing a horde known as the Harvesters of Jira. Laden, a knight, is the only one left who can save Lorelei. Oh, and Laden and Jira are brothers. Elemental Master is unique in a few ways. Not only is your character completely landlocked, but you're not playing as any sort of ship or tank. You are Laden, traipsing through a series of vertically scrolling levels, laying waste to anything that gets in your way. Or anything in your wake, for that matter. Success in Elemental Master depends on Laden watching his six. He's able to shoot both in front and behind, by alternating between the A and B buttons on the controller. And while watching your back in a scrolling shooter isn't anything new, having full control over which direction you're firing definitely makes the game feel fresh and forces you to play in a whole different way to previous shooters on the Mega Drive. At the beginning of Elemental Master, you get to choose between one of 4 stages. Upon defeating each stage boss, you're rewarded with its elemental weapon. You can then switch weapons at will in subsequent levels.
These new elemental weapons can be charged to fire more powerful projectiles or effects that damage every enemy on screen. The story bits continue throughout the game. Early on, Loudon saves a fairy named Nina. As you progress into the endgame sequence, once you've beaten the 4 opening levels, she reveals herself to be the reincarnation of the legendary ring that controls the elements, and gives her powers to Loudon. Now you're in control of the mighty light element. Elemental Master is a bit on the weird side, and it doesn't drip with the level of quality you'd expect from a Technosoft game on the Mega Drive. But it's still pretty darn good, and if nothing else, its uniqueness makes it worth playing. I especially like how each press of the fire button results in a burst of fire, meaning a continuous stream of rapid-fire shots doesn't require superhuman reflexes or a special controller. I also really dig how the relatively lengthy story scenes have been incorporated into the game. We weren't seeing a lot of that on the Mega Drive up until this point. Elemental Master did get a US release, though it took publisher renovation almost 3 years to bring the game stateside. It's a pity, because it most likely felt pretty dated by then. Had this game been released in North America before Sonic hit halfway through 1991, I think it would be more fondly remembered today. Australia wasn't nearly so difficult a region to enter, although, again, both Nintendo and Sega used third parties to market and distribute their products. Nintendo went through Mattel, while Sega's hardware was released by Aussiesoft.
Planet Earth. A scientist creates the ultimate machine.
At last!
In November 1990, Aussiesoft released the Mega Drive in the land down under. Unlike in Japan and the US, Australia was quite kind to the Master System. In fact, the roles of the Master System and NES were almost reversed there. The Nintendo console was considered almost uncool, while pretty much everyone had a Master System.
Mega Drive from Sega.
Even the marketing problems were similar. Like Tonka with the US Master System, Mattel reportedly did a terrible job getting the word out on their Nintendo video game system.
We are Nintendo Ultimate TV Game System.
Otherwise, the market was flooded with Amiga and Commodore 64 computers. It was very similar to the UK, apparently. In fact, the Australia Mega Drive was essentially the UK model with an updated power supply. Aussiesoft had a huge distribution network, which is why more than a few publishers signed distribution deals with them, such as Codemasters, Acclaim, and Microprose. Aussiesoft's huge network helped Sega's hardware to great success in the region. It didn't hurt that the main gaming magazine in the early 90s, Megazone, was published by Aussiesoft and had notoriously poor Nintendo coverage. In a strange twist, Sega acquired Aussiesoft in 1992, but it wasn't until the company sold Megazone to another publisher in 93 that the magazine began covering Sega hardware exclusively. By all accounts, the popular games market in Australia basically mirrored that of the United Kingdom.
Here we have the Mega Drive's third Mahjong game, and I still don't know how to play properly. Apologies for the footage. Gambler Jiko is actually a licensed game, based on a manga series by Masayuki Katayama that ran in Weekly Young magazine for 100 issues. It's centered on Doujou, a pro gambler and chain smoker with amazing luck and a strong skill in Mahjong. As the series wore on, Doujou would take on various guest characters in matches, some of whom would eventually become series regulars. The series was essentially gag manga, which is to say it featured a lot of absurd comedy. Katayama had another Mahjong series at the time, which was much more hardcore about the game. Katayama seems to be a Mahjong fanatic. The Japanese entry on Wikipedia says he was a member of the manga club while studying at Meiji University, but spent more time playing Mahjong than drawing. Most of the series in his decades-long career have been focused on the game. As far as I can tell, Gambler Jiko has 3 different modes. A free play mode where you decide which of the series' many characters you want to play against. A story mode that I can only assume is related to some of the events in the series. And a Mahjong Dojo, where players are quizzed on the many aspects of Mahjong. Katayama's series was quite prolific. While this is the first Gambler Jiko game to appear on a Sega console, it appears to be the 6th one to come out in general, after previous appearances on machines like the MSX, Famicom, and PC Engine. The game was developed by a group called Yellow Horn, which, unfortunately, I can't seem to find much information about. However, Gambler Jiko is the first console game published by Game Arts, which is much more significant. Founded in March of 1985 by brothers Takeshi and Yoichi Miyagi, Game Arts traces its roots all the way back to the University of Tokyo Microcomputer Club. Members of this group, which at one point were under contract to create games for Taito, none of which were published by the way, ended up working at ASCII's second division in the early 1980s. According to interviews in John Suspeniak's Untold History of Japanese Game Developers Volume 1, it was here that members of what would eventually become Game Arts crossed paths with Mitsuhiro Matsuda. Matsuda was a man who saw the sorry state of Japanese computer games and aimed to change all of that through the AX series, a collection of technically impressive, creative games featuring very high-quality packaging. The group of groundbreaking programmers and designers wanted to take advantage of the upcoming PC-88 computer standard, and so broke off to form Game Arts. One of the co-founders of this new studio was also Matsuda himself, and he brought with him his vision of high-quality, technically impressive games. In fact, Game Arts' first offering, Thexter, was heavily inspired by the AX game Theseus. Thexter was so impressive and such a big hit that American heavyweight publisher Sierra Online licensed it and a few other Game Arts games for release in North America. Game Arts games were just really impressive for the time. Sylphid, its third game, is a fully 3D shooter with some fantastic music. Like most Japanese computer developers, Game Arts found itself shifting toward console games, starting in 1989 with Faria, an action RPG for the Famicom. Faria is only the second RPG developed by Game Arts, which is important considering the company's identity is so strongly built on later hits like Lunar and Grandia. Gambler Jiko on the Mega Drive represents Game Arts' first stab at being a console publisher, and kicked off a long relationship with Sega, as Game Arts would stick to publishing and developing games almost exclusively for Sega hardware over the next 8 years. To be fair, this isn't the most exciting debut for a publisher on the Mega Drive, but we'll be seeing a lot more impressive stuff from Game Arts in future episodes. December 1990 saw the official launch of the Mega Drive in Brazil, but not by Sega. Rather, the system was launched by Tectoy, a relatively new toy company.
Tectoy was founded in 1987 by a group of former Sharp engineers headed by Daniel Daskal. Daskal and the other leaders of the company saw a big opportunity to grow the electronic toy market in Brazil and kicked off their attempt to do so by licensing their first toy, the Zillion Gun, from Sega of Japan. While there was a video game market in Brazil, it was simply overrun with pirated cartridges and clone consoles. Even Gradient, a company with the official rights to sell third-party NES games, was selling pirated games and clone consoles as well. Brazil was a tough market in the 80s. A period of economic crisis and political turmoil led to hyperinflation. For some reason, Tectoy decided to wade into this situation and release an actual, legitimate game console in Brazil in 1989, the Sega Master System. In 1990, they went the step further and released the Mega Drive, complete with a television marketing campaign and customer support the likes of which was very rare in Brazil. In order to circumvent the high cost of importing goods into the country, Tectoy soon began manufacturing Mega Drives right in their own factory. This was, of course, overseen by Sega, who had very recently had a terrible experience when licensing the Master System to Tonka in the United States. From what I can gather, Tectoy's real advantage was their spectacular customer service. Not only did their customers get legitimate licensed consoles and games, but they got access to service centers all over the country, which were licensed local shops, similar to how Nintendo handled NES repairs in North America back in the day. Customers also got membership to the Sega Club, which produced a regular magazine full of information, tips and tricks, and even coupons for non-gaming paraphernalia. Again, from what I understand, none of this was very common in Brazil. Eventually, Gradient would get the rights to manufacture Nintendo consoles in Brazil under the name Playtronic, but this wasn't until 1993, well after Tectoy had cornered the market. The Brazilian market was an important one for the Mega Drive. The system saw loads of success there, and Tectoy was releasing new games for the console even after the launch of the Dreamcast at home and abroad. We'll be seeing their name multiple times throughout the rest of Generation 16.
The latest anime licensed platformer for the Mega Drive comes courtesy of Vic Tokai. In fact, this is the first game that the telecommunications company actually published for the system. Its previous appearance, Whip Rush, was published by Sega itself. In Magical Hat, you play as Hat, who has apparently fallen into devildom and has to defeat the evil king. As you can see, it's a platformer featuring some pretty decent graphics and multiple ways to attack each enemy. Hat can hop on his enemies, punch them, or if he collects Robo-Kid, the little white egg-shaped character, he can throw his friend at distant enemies. Having Robo-Kid on his back also allows Hat to take more than one hit. But that's a bit of a problem in this kind of physics-based platformer. To say Hat's a bit skatey is an understatement. You need to get up ahead of steam in order to make longer jumps, and Hat isn't always able to stop on a dime. Considering that enemies can appear without much warning, even out of item boxes, this game can get really frustrating really quick. The various potions that can be found alleviate the problem somewhat, though. They can do everything from clearing a screen of enemies to making Hat invincible for a limited amount of time. And the level design is pretty varied as well. While a lot of levels have you searching around a fairly open world to find a particular item before you can leave, even if you've already defeated the boss of the stage, some are forced scrolling, some are more vertical than others, and some have Hats swimming around underwater. This game was pretty timely, all things considered. As an anime series, Magical Hat only ran for about 16 months, from 1989 to 1990. The Mega Drive game came out only a few months after the series was over. If Magical Hat looks a bit familiar, well, it should. Vic Tokai got a lot of mileage out of this concept. It first appeared on the Famicom as Kakefu-kun no Jump Tengoku, otherwise known as Kid Cool in the West. You see a lot of the same elements here, the springy flagpoles used to launch Kid Cool, the momentum-based platforming, and the little object that can be found and thrown. All in all, though, this was not a great game. The second time around, the game appeared on the Sega Master System as Psycho Fox. Here, players still couldn't scroll backwards, making some larger jumps tough to do if you'd move the screen too far forward. This version did, however, introduce the ability to punch enemies along with throwing projectiles, and also gave players the option of morphing into different animals, which resulted in slightly different gameplay. Psycho Fox is steeped in Japanese visuals and references, so it's kind of ironic that the game was never actually released in Japan. The Master System was all but done there by the time it came out anyway. For the launch of Psycho Fox in Brazil, Tectoy inserted a cartoon frog named Sapo Zule as a replacement for Psycho Fox, as well as reworking some of the other character graphics. Tectoy released a few different Sapo Zule reskins for the Master System over the years. Sapo Zule was a popular character in Brazil, a frog suffering from major foot odor. Vic Tokai basically released the same game 3 years in a row, each time refining it a bit more. 4 years in a row, actually, when you count the US release of Magical Hat and the further revisions made to the formula. As with any game based on Japanese manga and anime, either the publisher acquires the rights to the material in each new country of release, or the game gets remastered. Of course, in Magical Hat's case, it was the latter. Magical Hat eventually came to the US and other territories as DecapAttack. And honestly, the transformation is so complete, it's almost hard to tell the games have the same origin. The graphics and sound have been completely overhauled, to the point that DecapAttack not only contains new music, but uses an entirely different audio engine than Magical Hat. DecapAttack is all about the puns. The new star of the game is Chuck D. Head because, he throws his head. He's out to help Professor Frankenstein take down the evil Max Decap, who's trying to invade the world of the living. DecapAttack obviously shares the same variety as Magical Hat, right down to the Amidakuji bonus levels, where you place a series of chucks on various paths and see where they finish as the screen scrolls up. The presentation isn't the only thing that changed during the transformation, though. You'll notice that, unlike Hat, Chuck actually has a life bar. A life bar that can be extended if you find more heart icons hidden in each level. And the enemies hiding in some of those item statues actually give Chuck a bit of grace period before they attack. Oddly enough, though, some of the levels have been reworked to compensate for this more forgiving setup. Things like this spring-loaded obstacle at the end of the forced-scrolling totem pole level. In Hat, this obstacle just isn't there. Overall, I'd actually say DecapAttack is the slightly more difficult game. Magical Hat can be overwhelming at first, but once you get the physics down, the game itself isn't unfairly difficult. DecapAttack, on the other hand, takes a bit longer to master. DecapAttack got a fairly large push by Sega of America, featured in 2-page ad spreads in major video game magazines in 1991. In the UK, the game was pushed hard as well. Over there, Chuck, Max, and Professor Frankenstein were featured in a relatively long-running comic book series. Magical Hat was also released as DecapAttack in Brazil and South Korea. I was never a huge fan of DecapAttack back in the day, mostly because I just didn't have the patience to get very good at it. The finicky physics and the reliance on finding a specific doodad to exit a lot of the levels never sat very well with me. Playing it all these years later, though, I kind of have an appreciation for it. It's become one of the key titles in the history of the Genesis. Now it's Namco's turn to add to the great Mega Drive shooter deluge of December 1990. Like its arcade counterpart, Dangerous Seed never made it out of Japan. The game begins with a ship that, inexplicably, splits into 3 parts. Now you must guide the first, smallest part of the ship through the initial levels, battling all sorts of insect-based enemies as you hurtle through space on your way to destroy the Danger Seed. Once you reach level 5, the second and eventually third parts of your ship will reappear and reattach. After this happens, you're able to switch your formation on the fly, which results in different types of fire. Alpha formation concentrates fire to the front, while Beta is a mix of frontal assault and lateral fire. The final formation sends fire to the rear of your ship. Players who just want to experience the levels where all 3 ship segments are present can simply set the difficulty to digest mode and skip the opening levels altogether. During each level, I didn't really find these different formations too useful, especially because the standard enemies in each level take a ton of bullets to destroy. A full-on frontal assault seems like your only real chance most of the time. Spreading out your fire seems really ineffectual. The bosses, on the other hand, aren't nearly as tough. And since they tend to move around the whole screen, using all 3 formations is pretty effective. Dangerous Seed on the Mega Drive makes a few departures from its arcade counterpart. While the segmented ship still breaks apart at the beginning of the game and eventually reforms, giving you new formations to play with, the ship segments themselves act as your life system in the arcade game. Until all 3 ships form again, you're left piloting the first piece of the ship through the first part of the game. Should this segment be destroyed, your second life consists of playing as the second segment of the ship, complete with different weaponry. Likewise, if this is destroyed, the final ship segment is your last hope. Lose this piece, and it's game over. There are other differences too. Specifically, the sheer amount of damage each enemy can take and the overall length of each level. After playing the coin-op version of Dangerous Seed, the levels in the Mega Drive game seem to go on forever. Dangerous Seed marks what appears to be the first game from developer Tosa for the Mega Drive. Tosa may not be a name you've heard before, but you've almost definitely played its game. The studio is sort of a vendor, sometimes working on parts of games, other times working on whole games for bigger studios. And its name is almost never on the games it develops. Founded in 1979, Tosa got its console start in the mid-80s working on games for multiple publishers. And while there's some real crap in its past, Tosa has also had a hand in games like Kid Icarus and the Game & Watch series for Nintendo, the Bases Loaded series for Jalico, the Namco Museum games on the PlayStation, and even some of the portable Dragon Quest games. Tosa is still going strong today, with over 1,000 employees across multiple studios in Japan and China. And you'll still almost never see its name on its products. And that's the reason why I'm saying this appears to be the first Tosa game on the Mega Drive. I can't be 100% sure. It's not surprising that Dangerous Sea didn't come to the US. Not only is it based on an arcade game released exclusively in Japan, but it's really not a very good port. The increased difficulty didn't make it a better game, and the amount of flicker and slowdown sucks a lot of the excitement out of the experience. And that'll do it for this episode of Generation 16. Thanks for watching. Join me next episode as we look at 3 more shooters released in December 1990. See you then.
Thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing to the channel, as well as supporting the show on Patreon. And of course, please visit the website and give the Facebook page a like. Thanks for your support.